Good morning, 7th graders. Today we're going to talk about page 292 to 301. I gave you a reading assignment and quiz on that, and now I'll give you a little bit of a lecture. So if you want to follow along, the labor force. America was growing like crazy. There were a lot of immigrants coming, and the country's population was growing naturally. And the immigrants mostly settled in the northeastern cities because they came not only for freedom and to become Americans, but also to get good jobs. So they were a lot of the people who were working in the workforce during this period of time. Now, from the late 1700s through about the mid 1800s, we were going through what was known as the First Industrial Revolution, which was the transformation of the American economy from mostly farming or agriculture to actually factories. And it had a tremendous influence on the way the country would develop. And of course, in Europe, the same thing was happening. Places like England and France and Germany and places like that. All right. A lot of the immigrants, like I said, settled in the Northeast and the cities, but a lot of them moved west as well. Minnesota had a lot of Scandinavians, Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, thus the name the Minnesota Vikings. Wisconsin had a lot of Germans. Iowa had a lot of Germans and Scandinavians settled there. So some people did move west, but a lot of them stayed in the east. There were a lot of people's rights problems during this time period because the new industries, there was no government oversight. In other words, there were no laws, no minimum wage, no safety laws, no retirement, no health care, none of that stuff. So if you owned a factory, you could pay what you wanted and treat your workers however you wanted because you always had other workers who were wanting to get the jobs. The workers did try to get a few rights here and there. They established some what were called trade unions, depending on what they did. Iron workers, printers, glass makers, shipbuilders, and so forth. But they failed. That's by about the 1840s, they had all died off. So anyhow, so that's a little bit about the labor force. Natural resources were plentiful. The United States is a big country, so we're not going to talk any more about that. Some of the tools and equipment that were invented were pretty important. Mostly over in England. We got a lot of the stuff from over in England. It led to the large-scale production of cloth and material and clothing, which is known as textiles. Okay, textiles. That's the production of cloth. And there was a tool called the power loom in the late 1700s that sort of revolutionized things. It could actually spin and weave material pretty quickly. And initially it was powered by water, flowing water. But later the textile industry depended on steam power to run the machinery. With all the need for raw materials for the clothing, the material of choice was cotton. So down south, the plantations grew the cotton and the slaves worked on those plantations. They picked the cotton was then sent up north and used to make the clothing. So slaves were the foundation of both the plantation economy and the textile economy as well, because they did the work. So the North was guilty of slavery, just like the South was at this point in time. There was a tremendous demand for the new products around the world, especially in Europe and in the United States. The British had their own textile industry. Cotton's a whole lot more comfortable than wool, obviously. Now, in order to get stuff to market, you had to have transportation. So looking at the way the United States transported goods, the roads up until the early 1800s were pretty bad, and most people tried to travel by the rivers or by the oceans, Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic Ocean. Well, somebody came up with the idea of creating private roads that were actually maintained in good condition. And to ride on those roads, you paid a toll. They lifted what was called a turnpike, and you could travel down the road. And so the idea of turnpikes was created. And they were roads that were actually kept in very good condition for people. We still have turnpikes today, especially back east. You pay a toll on a highway, and you go. And the toll money helps pay for the upkeep of the road. So that idea of turnpikes started back in the 1830s and 40s. This was also the era of the canals. A canal is a big ditch filled with water that connects two bodies of water usually. And America, especially in the Northeast, saw a lot of canals being built from the Ohio River to the Great Lakes. But the most important canal was the Erie Canal in upstate New York. It connected the Great Lakes to New York City. Prior to this, if you were a farmer in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, you would have to send your farm products or whatever you were producing down the Mississippi or Ohio rivers and then take a ship all the way around to New York. Now all you had to do is load your stuff on a boat and go across the Great Lakes to the Erie Canal and take it directly to New York. They used barges, which are sort of flat-bottom boats that you can put a lot of stuff on. They used barges in the canals, and those barges were pulled by horses or oxen or mules and driven by one or two men. And so it was relatively cheap to transport stuff on the canals. So it helped the farmers and the other people out west to get their products back east, and make a pretty good profit in doing it because it didn't cost as much to take the canals. The other important thing about the Erie Canal was it connected the Midwest to the North, and that's going to be important during the Civil War because places like Illinois are going to produce a lot of good soldiers for the Union Army against the South. And the last thing that was important was New York City grew. New York City became the most important city in the United States, and it still is to this day as a result of the Erie Canal. Ultimately, the most important invention was the steam engine. You boiled the water, and the steam that you produced powered the engine. And you could apply the engine to a lot of different things to run factory equipment. You could put it on a boat, and you didn't have to rely on the wind to blow your boat or oars anymore, paddles. You could use steam power to go up and down rivers, no problem. You didn't need the wind, and you could go against the current pretty easily. They also applied steam engines to railroads. Now, there were old railroad tracks that horses would pull, railroad cars on and stuff like that. But they built machines that could do it, and they were the first steam engines. So the railroad era of American history started in the 1830s, lasted all the way up to probably about 1950. We still use railroads a lot, but not much for passenger travel. Money and credit was important because these new industries needed money available. They needed to get loans, so banks began to grow, especially up north and in the Northeast. There was the Bank of the United States and later the Second Bank of the United States, which loaned money to people. There were state banks as well. So you could actually get a loan and pay it back because of the growth of these banks. Everybody wanted to make a profit, and of course a profit is the money left over after you've paid all your bills, your workers, and paid for your raw materials and stuff. Any money that's left over, that's your profit. So these early factories created a lot of profit for these first factory owners. Now, the two groups of people that were affected the most were women and children. A man by the name of Francis Lowell up in Massachusetts, in what is today Lowell, Massachusetts. It's named after him, the town of Lowell. He created the Boston Manufacturing Company, which was a textile mill. And he hired the young women from the surrounding farms to come actually live at the factory and work at the factory. And he was highly successful. It was actually a pretty good factory to work at, and a lot of the girls liked working there. They lived in a dormitory. The company provided their food and shelter and all that sort of stuff. Older women looked after the girls. The girls had clubs. They had their own newspapers. They read books. They went to school. But they worked hard, 10 to 12 hours a day, usually 6 days a week. Now, children were also hired, and the reason for that was little children had little bitty small hands that could reach back into the machinery to untie knots and tie knots and whatever they needed them to do. There were no child labor laws, so a lot of young children actually began to work at these factories. Now, there was a horrible thing called slavery that was going on mostly down south, and some of the women in America, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony became abolitionists who opposed. They would go around and speak and write in magazines and newspapers and stuff against the evils of slavery. But they also became America's very first feminists. They believed in women's rights. So in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a friend of hers, Lucretia Mott, organized a women's rights convention at Seneca Falls, and it became known as the Seneca Falls Convention. It's the first feminist convention in American history. 40 men attended it, 200 women, and they came up with a Declaration of Rights for Women. And it started out, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. So they were the first to say that women should get equality. One of the problems women faced was they could not vote. Suffrage is the right to vote. And there was no women's suffrage in America. Women were not allowed to vote, I should say. They didn't have that right. So they began what was called the Women's Suffrage Crusade. They were not going to be successful until 1920. So it took them a good, basically 70 years for women to get the right to vote. Already told you about children. Now, one of the other things that happened as a result of the new industries, the men who owned the industries needed professionals, educated professionals to help them run, clerks and mechanics and secretaries and people who knew what they were doing, pretty smart people. So it led to the growth in high schools. So instead of just going to like 8th grade or 7th grade or whatever, some people went beyond that into high school to learn the skills that were needed in these new industries. It also led to the growth of colleges. Now, up until this time, college education was classical education, very similar to APA. It had Latin and rhetoric and all that sort of stuff. But that stuff really was not that useful when it came to the factories. They needed practical stuff for people to learn, more mathematics and things like that. So Congress passed what was known as the Land-Grant College Act. And what it did was it established colleges around the country to train. They wanted to train farmers and engineers and school teachers. And they became known as A&Ms, agriculture and mechanical. So like Utah State was an A&M at one point in time. Texas A&M. There are lots of different A&M colleges that still exist as a result of this. And so people decided that they were going to go to these colleges to learn how to be better farmers, to learn how to be clerks, to learn how to be engineers, to work in these factories and build these factories, and learn how to be school teachers to train people in the high schools that, would then send their graduates to these factories to be professionals. So not only did you have the poor workers, the working class, but you had the beginning of the growth of what became known as the middle class, which were more highly educated, they got paid more, and they were treated better because they were helping the owners of these factories. So a lot between 1800 and 1850 and 1860, a lot was going on in America with the American economy. A lot of factory growth, revolutionary transportation, canals, and more importantly, the railroads, steamboats going up and down the rivers and streams and so forth. A lot of immigrants coming to work in the cities or to move out west and to farm as well. And women, for the first time, were working outside the home. So that pretty well sums it up, and I will wish you a very good day. Have a good one. Bye.